Hello, and thank you for joining us this month again for Tiger Talk TV. I'm Jeremy Williams, the superintendent, and I'm joined this month with Dion Karen, our Director of Business Services. And today we're going to talk a bit about the budget and some facilities projects and stuff taking place this summer. You know, we often hear how summer must be such a quiet time at the school because the kids aren't there and it must be really quiet. And that's not really the case in our office, at least. And certainly with summer school, programming and stuff going on, still a lot of things. So I'll look forward to that conversation today with Dion. Before we get to that, I do have just a few general announcements again to share with the community. Kind of go through a few things from the district for this month. First thing, with our early childhood programming, we have some programming taking place this summer that we haven't done in a few years. So some ESSER funds have provided the opportunity to provide summer programming to early childhood families. We have 2 classes taking place at parks in this community as well. So some family things and family education pieces taking place, so new programming there. Parkside also shares this month. They have a lot of all the building projects completed, so we're back to hosting summer school at Parkside. That hasn't happened in a couple of years. Another thing with summer school, it's back to fully in person, just like the school year was this year, so that's going really well. That started this past week. The students had been gone for a week off, and came back, and they're all smiles and ready to go again, so that's been fun. Middle school, they're sharing this month. We had students participating in the Maud Hart Loveless Reading Challenge. So it's a reading challenge the middle school did. They had 107 students meet that requirement this year. So thank you to all the reading participants, the staff, and the parents for helping the students complete that challenge and be part of that program this year. I want to share that the Pride in the Tiger Scholarship Banquet, our scholarship ceremony, took place on May 18th at the high school. We had 143 scholarships and awards distributed that night. There was over $194,000 to members of the 2022 graduating class that was awarded. So big thanks to Krista Biella, the Pride in the Tiger Executive Director, and to Deb Mittling, the admin assistant at the high school, for all their work to put that event together. It was a very nice event for our students. I also want to thank the American Indian Parent Advisory Committee. We had an end-of-the-year event, spring event that they hosted. It was a stormy night on Wednesday, May 11th. That spring event was really well received. We had a lot of activities taking place. One of the highlights of that evening was American Indian artist John Sterner. He entertained students with horse stick art. The students were able to produce an art project and actually bring it home with them that evening, in addition to a meal and some other things that they could do. So it was a nice evening, and thank you to that advisory committee for that work. Another thing going on, we have our summer school programming all taking place. Like I mentioned earlier, we've had back to traditional face-to-face summer school pieces. K through 8 summer school began on Monday, June 13th, again at Parkside Elementary. We have more than 200 students registered in that program, so that's going really well. Also want to share that part of that programming this year, they're doing like a camp theme this year, so a lot of hands-on, different types of activities. Students got to make a roller coaster and a bunch of other things taking place throughout the summer too. So a lot of fun activities as they're learning, reviewing the different things with that too. So some other things they're going to do is paper airplanes, some with cards, our cars, coding. It says mice. I'm not sure, Deanna, if they're talking about actual mice or if this is something like a computer mouse or exactly what that one is, but something fun taking place there, and all sorts of other things taking place this summer too. So. Another event taking place, we've talked a lot this year about our CEO program, the Entrepreneurial Opportunities Program. We had a kickoff event on May 23rd that took place at Britton's Roadhouse in Garvin, Minnesota. That event, we invited all the students that are able to be in this first inaugural class, and they got to do a signing activity. The parents were all there. We provided some food, and really a nice activity to kick that program off. So we're really excited about getting that going. That's where the students are going to get some business experience throughout the entire year next year as extra class that we've talked about before at Tiger Talk. It'll be a fun one to continue looking at next year. I also want to highlight right now, or today, our EL students. We talk about the MCA state testing that all students take, but our EL students take a test called the Access Test. It assesses their language skills as they're learning English language. We had over 45 students, or right at 45 students, meet exit criteria, meaning that they have met the criteria, they will no longer receive EL services. That number is up significantly from last year. We had 28 students exit last year. So that high number of students meeting exit criteria, that really reflects the work that our teachers have been doing as we're getting back to face-to-face instruction in a more typical looking school year. So I want to call out a big thank you to our EL program for that work. All right, Dion, that brings me to you. So let's talk a little bit more about, you got a lot of things going on this summer. So it's certainly a busy time in your office and with departments that you oversee. One of the big projects right now is the preliminary budget for next year. So we're talking about that. The board heard about it at a recent meeting, and now this next meeting they're going to be approving that budget. So let's talk a little bit about that and some drivers within that budget piece. Why don't you talk first about the past enrollment, because student enrollment is a big piece of district budget. So talk a little bit about where we've been, where we are now, and what we're projecting in future enrollment.
Yeah, like you said, the enrollment is a major driver of the district's revenue. We break that down a little more during the budget presentation and the truth and taxation presentation to kind of show where those revenues come in. But enrollment for both state and levy is a big driver, but the past 3 years have really been a roller coaster. Main cause of that is COVID. Enrollment we had 41 students less we were down 41 students last year, which was unexpected, but good news is we had a nice increase this year. We're up 50 students, which puts us kind of back on track where we were. And as you and I have worked on some of those enrollment projections, we see probably 22, 23 being another increase, right around 20 students. So we're back on track, and our enrollment's on the rise again.
Good. And just talk a little bit about how that enrollment, why that is such a factor in the budget.
So a lot of our state and levy revenue goes off of the number of students. It's an adjusted, so it's not actual bodies in seats, but it's the adjusted of how long they stay in our district. It's also weighted for our secondary, we get a little more funding. But any increase, decrease you see there, it's around $10,000 to $12,000 per student. So that year that we were down 40 students, it's the equivalent of $400,000 to $450,000.
Huge impacts in the budget, and the state really drives that all off enrollment. So good. So thinking about that increase in numbers, Marshall is really kind of unique when you look at our district compared to some other districts in the area and even around the state. But we've seen an increasing enrollment throughout the years. That's why we've had to build some new facilities and a lot of that kind of thing too. But that certainly impacts class size. More kids means we need more spaces for them and such too. So let's talk a little bit about class sizes. The board has some kind of set parameters around that, and where are we at with class sizes, and what is that looking like?
Yeah, as you know, in the community, class sizes are a big factor and concern, not only to the district, but the community has shown that in the past. We've had past operating referendums that have passed to keep our class sizes at a certain level, and our board, sets a certain guidelines of how many students per class, give and take, very little leeway on that, as we know. And we've seen that where our second grade has hit an enrollment where we had to add a second grade teacher this year, which is good news. It means that our enrollment's up. And as you had said, we built Southview for that purpose because we were running out of space. And we built it to have 9 classrooms, so we're actually able to have those classrooms available. But yeah, with all of our enrollment projections and our staffing that we've adjusted, we should be on the target guidelines for all of our grades.
That's awesome, because we know that there's a lot of kids and figuring out how many sections we need, and some of that we can just dig in a little bit. Some of that is it's not a fine science. Sometimes it's a bit of an art to figure out those projections, because we take the current enrollment numbers and see where are we at as far as rolling kids forward, and how many do we typically get coming in, especially at the high school level when we have other sites and other area districts serving some of those students when they become 9th graders too. So
yeah, and it's important for the public to know. We've expressed this to the board, and the board has been very good about our recommendations. But on the other side, we don't just add teachers.
Right.
For instance, our 4th grade has a smaller class size coming through, so we're able to shift one of those teachers to 3rd grade, which has an increase. So we're reducing our 4th grade and increasing our 3rd grade without any sort of a budget movement there.
Really trying to keep track of where those all fall. I know one of the other things that we hadn't put on our list, but one of the other things that we highlighted at the board meeting the other day was talking about open enrolled students. So that's a big piece too. We have a lot of kids kind of coming in that maybe don't live within our district but attend school here, and some students that live here that attend elsewhere, and there was a shift in those numbers this year too. You want to just touch base on that a little bit? Yeah,
and that's been something that I know you and I have talked about with our strategic planning, to keep an eye on that to see why, because we did have a shift where last year we were actually down a negative 5 students, which means 5 students open enrolled into other districts where they didn't enroll into ours. And this year we actually saw a positive number of 37. Now, COVID's going to have some impact on that, but it also hopefully is the trend that we see, that more students open enroll into ours than go to other districts.
Right. We certainly had a couple of years that were hard to set a benchmark off of those couple of years. So a lot of this we're looking back at a couple of years, looking at back to a more traditional pre-COVID, but then trying to figure out where our standard is going forward. But yeah, you're right. We had seen a downward trend with the open enrollment, and seeing that coming back up, that's a very positive thing to see. So good. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit more about the budget. So I know when we talk at the board meeting, there's a lot of different funds and such, but the main fund is our general fund, we call that. So let's talk a little bit about that one. And if you can just share some details about expenditures and revenue within that general fund.
Yeah, and I know not everybody gets excited about numbers and budgets like I do, but that's an important fact. You know, we have our general fund, which is really what we operate the school off of. We have these other funds, food service, which is obviously food service, transportation. We have our capital fund, which is more of our bricks and mortar, our furniture, those type of things, which is outside of our general fund. But our general fund, for budget-wise, we're looking at basically at about the same trend as we have in the past. Unfortunately, revenue is about the same trend too, which doesn't always meet. We were hoping legislature would open up a little bit with the surplus they have in the state, but we're not seeing any of that coming our way in any form. So we're overall, our general budget's probably looking right around a $300,000 deficit spending, which the full budget presentation is out on our board meetings, which we presented last on the 6th, and hopefully with the recommendation they'll approve that on Monday the 20th.
Yeah. I know one of the things that we've talked about, and we'll get into inflation and such in a little bit here too, but as the inflationary rate goes up and our school funding kind of stays steady, we end up with this gap that just is growing. So that's one of the things we'll need to address going forward, is how do we help close that so we can maintain the programs and the services and the class sizes and such that our community has come to expect and we really know is what's best for kids, and how do we do that with the resources that we have available. So we'll come back to, I think, that in a little bit here. But let's talk a little bit, too, as part of that general fund. One of the things that we've talked about a lot the last couple of years is COVID funding. So the federal government and the state government had issued a number of different funds. We're kind of referring to them as COVID funds or ESSER funds that have come through, and they've had a big impact on our budget the last couple of years. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that money and what we've done with some of that money and how that's all playing out?
Yeah, and I say this every time, we're so grateful to have gotten those funds. As you had talked about, and we'll talk a little bit more about the inflation going up, and our funding goes up, it doesn't close that gap. In the last 2.5 years, we've been able to use some of those COVID funds to offset some of that with whatever they're allowed to. There's several different funds, buckets, and we have to follow those guidelines. But we've been able to help offset some of our regular expenditures. We've spent anywhere from $1.1 to $2 million a year of these COVID funds. One-time money that will run out right now, unless they add more, will run out in the year 23-24. We've tried to be responsible in spreading that out to help operate and be at that deficit spending that we feel like we can afford, which $250,000 to $300,000. But yeah, $2 million a year that we've been able to help offset some of the expenditures, but also get some of that PPE we needed for COVID.
Right. Certainly we had additional expenses that covered, and that's what that money was for. And districts were facing decreasing enrollment where we started from, and during that decreased enrollment, this helped offset some of that too. So we were able to maintain programming throughout that time, and all the increased cost when we're providing extra online resources, none of those come free. So the district has to pay for those, and of course we don't charge families or students for those programs. So this helped cover all those things. In addition to a couple additional positions we had with custodial, some extra help that was needed, with some nursing services, some extra help that was needed, and some of those things that we couldn't have afforded if we didn't have these funds, and those positions simply don't exist after the funds are gone.
Yeah,
so.
Technology was a big one to be able to have for kids to have at home, internet, and other ways, so we could go into that hybrid or distance learning and still be able to operate.
Right. So that certainly has been a nice piece to have in there. So let's talk about fund balances and projections, because that's something we hear about, fund balances and where are we at, because you talk about deficit spending. Well, that money is coming from someplace, so we're not racking up extra debt or something by when you talk deficit spending. So talk a little bit about fund balances and how that impacts this budget too.
Yeah, so, and we'll talk a little bit about our history of operating referendums, but the last couple of years, our projected revised budget for the 21-22 year had us right around $250,000 deficit spending, and then this year for 22-23 at $300,000. Our fund balance right now, if our revenue or revised budget holds true, would be around 15%. Our board holds an 8%. We don't want to underspend 8%. Obviously, we don't want to really get close to 8%. We don't want to have to go through those cuts and changes, but we're able to take some deficit spending, but eventually that's going to catch up to us. It's about a 1.43% decrease with that $300,000, which would put us right around 13.85. So it does dip pretty fast. So we'll have to find some way to offset that with the COVID funds ending.
So for our viewers just thinking about some of those fund balances, kind of thinking about putting money in a savings account or something like that, setting it aside and not trying to dip into that, but knowing that sometimes we'll have to pull some out to cover extra expenses.
Yep.
Good. Let's talk next about, we touched on base, that's inflationary rate. So let's dig into that just a little bit. Talk about that inflationary rate, how that's impacting us, and knowing how the COVID funds have really helped impact that.
Okay. So, and we talk about this, not sure if everybody tunes in December during the Truth and Taxation presentation, which we really cover because of our levy. I mean, that's where the property tax comes in, and we show the community what's causing those property taxes increases and sometimes decreases. And part of that, we always show every year how the inflationary gap is going up and our state funding is not closing that gap. And it's really a kind of almost a disturbing graph because it keeps going further and further apart. So with that, you know, and we talked about it, we've been able to help keep that with the COVID funds, but the gap right now projected with where inflation is at, and obviously it's probably getting wider and wider with the way the economy is, but we're gapped at about $798 per student. So the gap between inflation and where we're funded is about $2.2 million gap. So we bring back what we're spending in COVID, $2 million a year. That's what's helping us basically stay afloat right now. So once that COVID money runs out, we have to find some other resource to help us with that. And like you had said, there's some additional positions that will be able to reduce some of those expenditures, but we're still going to need some of that extra funds, $1.8 million to help us operate at the class sizes and where we're at.
Right. And one of the things we talked about a little bit at the last board meeting, and we're certainly going to talk about more, we've got our financial advisors coming to a future board meeting, and over the next few months we'll be talking about an operating referendum a little bit and how that plays in. So Marshall has had an operating referendum previously. That's a mouthful. An operating referendum previously. We currently don't have any operating referendum in place. Can you talk a little bit about what an operating referendum is and why, how that would make a difference in our budget?
Yeah, you bet. So in the past, the last one was in 2011, that the voters passed the operating referendum. It was $675 per student, and that's on the number of students we have at that time. I think it was right around $1.5 million. Passed about 70% yes votes. The funding started in 2013, and then it ended in 2018. In 2018, we did not go out to renew that operating referendum. At that time, like we talked about, we felt like we could operate for a few years, saving some of the tax dollars, some funds. And then also the legislature had changed a little bit that the board could approve a certain amount. So those two things kind of help us offset, so we're going back to the voters right away. 72% of districts in Minnesota have an actual past operating referendum currently. And I was kind of surprised at this number. The average is $850 per pupil unit. So it kind of shows, 72% of the districts, it is something that districts count on to operate. So we'll need to look at that. to help offset that $798 gap between inflation and what the state's offering. And we'll do everything fiscally responsible that we can to help not have to ask for the whole amount, but we can close that gap ourselves. And like you had said, our financial advisors at Ellers will be here at the board meeting on Monday the 20th to present to the board and to the community who watch or come in, just kind of an outline of the operating referendum.
Right, and something like you mentioned earlier, the different pots of money and how some things are different. So to a viewer who might be thinking about the new elementary school or something like that, building the elementary school, that's a totally different conversation. It's different funding that covers that versus what covers operational expenses.
Yeah, it's a very important discussion to have to make sure everybody knows, we're redoing the track at the middle school. We just built the Southview Elementary, added on to Parkside. One of the things when we went through our building referendum for Southview and the security in Parkside early childhood was the community was very vocal on keeping our buildings up and running. So that is a totally separate pot. We last year for Parkside, a 30-year-old building, we've upgraded the HVAC system, boiler. It was time to do that so we can run it more efficiently. Recarpeting some of our schools when it's needed and not going the extent. Brick and mortar, I mean, all those things, and they all come out of a separate fund than the general fund, our operational fund. So yeah, it's very important that when somebody drives by and sees the new track, which was very much needed, and a community track, that's not what we're asking. We're not spending that money, Southview, to build Southview. This is separate.
Right. Good. Thank you for covering that. All right. Let's talk about something other than budget for a little bit. Food service. That's been something that's been drastically different the last couple of years, again, related to COVID. So for 2 years, families have had access to free breakfast and free lunches for any student, regardless of income or anything like that. So that's something that was provided by the federal government through the COVID funding, but that's going away. Yes. So talk a little bit about food service for this fall.
Yeah, we were kind of just waiting for somebody to make a move, whether it was federal government or state. Like you said, for the last 2 years, the federal government has funded breakfast and lunch, which has been awesome for our families. But that is coming to an end. We still have our summer food service program, which is free to anyone that's 18 or under, which is happening right now at Parkside and the high school. There's more information on our website about the times and locations on that. But yeah, we're going back to paid lunches this fall, and it's going to be important that we'll get some information out to all families, letting them know we are not increasing our prices, our breakfast and lunch prices that we had in 1920. We just don't feel like this is the time, and we've got a good fund balance in our food service that we don't need to take that step this year.
Right. So one of those things that, that was provided through the school district. It was a federally funded program, so the money was still coming through a different program to fund that, and it's something that we don't have that. So it's not like we just decided we're not doing that anymore. That wasn't a decision we were able to make.
Right.
Certainly would have liked to see that continue. So families this fall will receive the applications again for if they need some assistance with lunches. Certainly there is still some funding available, but it's through that free and reduced lunch application, and we're really going to be encouraging people to turn those back in this fall like we've done previously. In addition to the free lunches for the families or reduced price lunches, there is funding tied to that affects school district budgets as well. So some specific funds come in based off the percentage of families that qualify for free and reduced lunches. So
very important they fill out those forms, even if they are questioning whether they would qualify or not, because it's very important for them if they do qualify, and it's very important for us if they do qualify, because a lot of funding does tie into that also.
Which allows us to offer some additional programming and such too,
exactly,
with those funds tied to. So that'll be a change back to what was more traditional that we were hoping maybe would have become a permanent piece, but just it hasn't. So we'll talk about that. So you mentioned I'm going to switch topics again. You mentioned the track at the middle school. We have a lot of projects taking place, some long-term facilities maintenance projects and some general things taking place at our different schools. So let's talk a little bit about that. Middle school in particular is getting a lot of things this year, but the track, first of all, because that middle school track, it seems like now that Southview is completed with that beautiful playground there, I see a lot of community members coming in and using that track more than I've ever seen in the past. So certainly as we're seeing that used more, it's been on our radar for a while. It's needing some repair. It's been on our list, but it really has risen to a top of a priority need because there were some potholes in that track and
Yes.
it needed work. So talk a little bit about what's going on there.
So, I think COVID probably drove a lot of that too, but we see our middle school track being used a lot more. And it wasn't the safest track. It had worn, it just wasn't updated. And we also have a lot of use coming from Southview. It's actually dual used. Middle school uses it and Southview uses it for gym and recess. So it's redoing it is important, not just to our schools and the community, I mean, just as a whole. But we'll have that resurfaced this summer. We're going to actually be adding an irrigation system to the middle, which we use, but also community service and the city uses for soccer and football. So right now it's pretty hard and it's important safety-wise and just for use for our facilities. But we just very exciting projects going on. We are probably about 65-70% finished with the old pool area, which we need to convert to be calling like the multi-purpose area at the middle school.
There is no pool anymore.
There
it's
is no
gone.
pool.
So we got to call it. We got to start calling something, although we still refer to it as the pool area.
Yeah, so we're excited to have that process going, so we're able to use that area. That area needed to still be heated and cooled, so we might as well be using it. The middle school, I know, runs out of space when it rains or in the winter when they can't go out of recess, and also when there's several gym classes going on, so it'll be used for that. We'll be using it also probably for our main gymnastics area, which at the high school was not very good to use just because we had to haul the equipment back and forth, which for staff and equipment and for the floors wasn't good. So very excited about that and the track at the middle school. Like you said, a lot of projects going at the middle school. We focused on Parkside the last couple of years with a lot of projects, and we're moving to the middle school, and then our high school that's turning 17 years old.
Yeah, our new high school isn't new anymore.
Right, we'll be
time for some maintenance things there too.
one of the next ones on the list. We've got a huge roofing project that'll be 20 years old pretty soon that will have to be taking place.
Yeah, good. So a lot of things taking place at those buildings, and certainly summer schools taking place. So people driving by are going to see a lot of activity at a lot of our sites because there's a lot of things going on.
Yeah.
So we have just a couple minutes left, so let's just touch base briefly before we're done. The Career and Technical Institute, so the property on Highway 59 that we purchased, we're moving out there with some career and tech ed classes that were taking place. Originally, we were hoping that would open up this fall. Unfortunately, that's another project is getting pushed back a bit. We're running into some issues with supplies, availability of supplies for that project, and budgets. Things are costing a lot more than what they were when we originally did that. So some reworking taking place there. Just touch base briefly on where we're at with that and what our next steps are.
Yeah, I think the community is probably wondering what's going on with that, just because the community's been very excited about it and don't see any action out there. But like you said, it's just some delays, as everybody knows, with some materials and everything. But we do have the plans drawn up. We're submitting it to the state. Once the state approves it, we'll see some action, which will probably be around August, end of July, August. You'll start seeing some action out there.
Yep. So work is taking place. It's just kind of behind the scenes stuff.
Right.
Soon we'll be starting to take DOC construction taking place out there. But the facility is still very much a go. The building will still open up. It's just going to be delayed. Probably not till a year from this fall when we'll actually start running classes there. And maybe next summer we can have access to it. So project we're excited about and look forward to getting that up and going. And certainly the expansion of CTE is a need in our district and our community. And we want to make sure providing those opportunities for students, just as the board has discussed that. Conversation's been around, how do we make sure we do it right, not just get it done fast, just have it done. Exactly. So we want to make sure this is a high quality location that we can provide services at for our kids. So Deon, thank you for joining today and sharing about budgets and all the projects and stuff taking place there. I appreciate it. And thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in.